Hi, greetings. It's April 26th on Sunday afternoon, and we're here to listen to four outstanding students presenting their research from their honors theses um, at Tulane University. First, we'll hear from Derby Belser, who majored in English and music composition. Her thesis was directed by Professor Barbara Jazwinski and Professor Mike Kaczynski, and is entitled How to Write the Perfect Christmas Song. Next, we'll hear Jonathan Gutmann, who majored in linguistics and Spanish and Portuguese with minors in political science and religious studies. His thesis was directed by Professors Harry Howard and Amy George, and is entitled Determining Word Length Through Context, a Cross-Linguistic Information-Theoretic Approach. After that, we'll hear from Olivia Henderson, who majored in English and Medieval and Early Modern Studies. Her thesis was directed by myself and is entitled Like a Dull Actor, I Forgot My Part, Coriolanus and Shakespearean Autism. Since I said myself, I just realized I haven't introduced myself. I'm Scott Oldenburg, chair of the English department. And finally, last but not least, we'll be hearing from Mary Tyler Storms, who majored in English with a minor in French, and her thesis is entitled The Wise and Witty Women of Shakespeare's and Austen's Comedies, directed by Professor Molly Rothenberg. And so first, a big congratulations to the four of you, both for making it through, but also coming together to share your research, because it's often a sort of lonely thing where you're just writing and researching, and everything really comes together when you have the opportunity to share your research and talk to one another and ask each other questions. And so congratulations, and thank you for agreeing to participate in this. First up, we'll listen to Derby Belser and her present her research from How to Write the Perfect Christmas Song. Derby, take it away.
Yeah, so I was inspired to do this project because when I was little, granted I was like 12, this was when Bieber first came out with his like mistletoe song. And I remember I asked my grandma if we could play it at dinner, and she said absolutely not, like no. She was like, no young music at the Christmas dinner table. And ever since then, I've been fascinated by the Christmas genre as a static genre where only songs that hold nostalgia can have a place on the canon. So freshman year when I got here and started majoring in music composition, I looked into it just a little bit. And there was a study done by Dr. Joe Bennett at Berklee College of Music entitled something similarly of like what makes the perfect Christmas song. And he analyzed, I think, it was like the top 100 hits the UK, and he took them apart by like time signature, key signature, presence of jingle bells, who sang it, if Michael Bublé sang it, and what it was about. And so he ended up giving this information to a team of songwriters at Berklee, and it might have been at Berklee, or one of his colleagues went to Berklee with him. Anyway, and they put together this song called Love's Not Just for Christmas. And it was sung by this like whole choral group, and it completely flopped. No one listened to it. It wasn't successful. And so I wanted to go back in and reanalyze everything that he did and see if I could find why the song wasn't successful. And also, I kind of had this idea that the success of each Christmas song can't be because of their similarities. There has to be differences in each for each of these songs to be able to make a canon which hasn't changed in 30 years. So I went in and analyzed the top holiday 100 from streaming charts for the past 3 years, and took out the 52 consistently charting songs and removed all of their covers. So I only took or considered the cover that was the highest charted and remained on the charts for all those 3 years. So anyway, so I went in and analyzed each song musically, contextually, and lyrically. So I looked at the harmonic, melodic, rhythmic language of each song, went in and looked at the poetic language, if there were lyrics, and for all but about 3 there were. And then I talked about the history of each song, the producers, the writers, the singers, the reputation, the label, etc. So with all of that, I went in and pieced together this whole comprehensive study, one that hadn't been done before. People are really interested in the story behind the songs, but they're not interested in the music behind the songs. So I kind of had to take from different places, which was fun because I couldn't just look at academic scholarship. I had to look at random blogs on like Donny Hathaway from like 30 years ago. So that was a lot of fun to be able to kind of reimagine what scholarship is in the musical field. Anyway, I put all of these songs together and found that there are about 5 things that lead to a song success in the Christmas canon. One is proximity to crisis. Another is visual association. Mary Tyler, you asked about the association with films. A lot of these songs were successful because of their mentioning in a film. Then they all use functional harmony, with is what we're familiar, it's what we hear. Their presence of all of the Christmas themes or more than one of them. And then each song had to spend a certain amount of time on the canon before it was canonized. So regarding the contemporary canon, I kind of took that as consistently charting for multiple years and still remaining on our charts today. So even with the Mariah Carey song, All I Want for Christmas Is You, which is the tail end of my thesis, she is the last one, and she wrote that in 1994, I believe. She is the last one to consistently chart, which is fascinating. So we haven't had a Christmas song join the contemporary canon in 30 years because none of them have withstood the test of time. So that kind of leads to what I found in all of this is that so much of this is timing and the ability to become as mentally canonized as it does on the charts. So with all of that in mind, the thesis kind of made me realize what we value in the Christmas season, because we know that Christmas as a holiday is no longer really religious. It's more commercialized and it's more American than it is a religious celebration, at least in popular culture. And so it also showed me how we can have the existence of a static genre, because the only other genre that's kind of static is classical music, because we're constantly saying classical music is dead or something along those lines. And Christmas music is similar in that it's entirely led by the public. We get to decide what makes a canon and what doesn't. And that's really unusual for popular music because normally it's who has the money, who has the reputation. But we get to decide, oh, I remember hearing that when I was little or I didn't. And of course, there are issues of access there as well. But as of now, we get to decide if the canon will evolve or not. So it has a lot of significance for the music world because we don't really have a genre that acts and lives like this. So I think it is really useful research, at least on my end as a composer, to see how I can write for a canon that doesn't move, and also for future writers who want to write for the Christmas genre. I gave like a whole list of recommendations. So yeah, that was my thesis on how to write the perfect Christmas song. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Derby. Next up, we'll hear from Jonathan Gutmann and his thesis, Determining Word Length Through Context, a Cross-Linguistic Information-Theoretic Approach.
All right, hello everybody. So really changing gears, my thesis is in the realm of linguistics, and specifically linguistics is a very broad field, but this is dealing with something called information theory, which is sort of an up-and-coming branch of the field that's not just applied to linguistics. I'll give a little bit of a background. So I first became interested in information theory over this past summer when I attended the Linguistic Society of America's Summer Institute. This is sort of like a large gathering of linguists that happens every 2 years over the summer. They have a bunch of different classes across the field. And this was a really cool theory to me because it sort of looked at information and how it's transmitted across, utterances, across sentences, across words. So I will sort of explain what my thesis is through the lens of information theory. But before I do that, I want to give you a tiny bit of background as to what that means. Now, this was developed back in the 1940s by a man by the name of Claude Shannon. It was actually right after World War II, and it's a theory that seeks to quantify information or sort of describe what exactly is information and then measure it. Now, information can be contained in a lot of different things. So you could have information in a word or a sentence, but you could also have it in a strand of DNA or in a barcode. So it's not just a linguistic thing. It uses a series of mathematical formulas that are based on probability to sort of quantify information and look at what information really means. And taking just a step back to make the rest of my thesis a little bit more understandable, essentially, information is linked, according to Shannon, to surprisal. So if you had, like, say, a coin that had one side was heads and the other one was tails, but you didn't know if it was an evenly weighted coin, maybe one of them was weighted a little bit differently, so you would get heads more often, maybe you get tails more often. If you were to flip that coin, say 5 times, then based on when you got tails and when you got heads, you would have information. You would learn something new from each result. However, let's say that you were to have a coin that might also be weighted, or it might be fair, you don't know, but both sides were heads. If you were to flip that coin 5 times, you would learn nothing. You would not get any information because there's only one outcome. So I wish that I had a little more time to explain this, because I know that it's a really weird way of looking at information, especially from someone who's not super familiar with this theory, but that's the basis of my thesis. And so I was actually looking at a theory that came out several years ago called the Uniform Information Density Hypothesis. And that's a very complicated term, but essentially what that means is we as human beings, no matter what language we're speaking, we want to convey information at a relatively even rate over time. So we don't like it as humans if somebody says, say, speaks for 100 words, the first 20 words are like really novel, really surprising new information that you didn't know before, and then the last 80 words are just redundant, saying the same thing over again. We don't like that. And so this theory says that we want to sort of spread out and keep even the rate of the transmission of information. And once again, information being calculated with probability, which is this whole mathematical concept that I won't go into. And so I was looking, okay, like, does this theory does it hold up? And I specifically modeled my thesis off of a study from 2013, Mahowald et al. And that study looks at long and short word forms to test this theory. So they're semantically identical, like they mean the same thing, long and short word forms. Like in English, fridge and refrigerator. When do we choose to use fridge versus refrigerator? And this study that I based mine off of found that it all has to do with context. So if you have a very high context sentence, like for example, John went into the kitchen and pulled a nice cold beer out of the blank, people in that context, according to Mahowald, tended to choose fridge because you have a lot of information that's already there. So when you get to the last word of the sentence, you can choose either a short word or a long word. And according to this hypothesis, if you have a lot of information that you want to convey, you need a longer word to sort of diffuse that transmission over time. Whereas if you basically already know what's coming, in the case of this example I just gave, you know it's going to be that cold thing in the kitchen no matter which word you choose. You really just need a short word to convey that short amount of information. It's proportional. So that's what they found. And I was thinking, okay, well, I want to see if this holds up in other languages because really it's just been tested in English. So I tested this in Spanish, Portuguese, and German. I did two things, two parts of my experiment. Number one was a behavioral component where I did a survey of native Spanish speakers. I came up with a list of questions, much like that refrigerator example I just shared, but in Spanish. And I had a blank at the end of the sentence, and I forced speakers, ethically of course, to choose between the two options. The short word, like a Spanish example would be kilo versus kilogramo, which is the long form meaning kilo and kilogram. So that's what I did for the behavioral component. I also did a corpus analysis. Corpus is a fancy term for just like a really long list of words. So for example, like all of the Google books that exist on any topic that have ever been on the internet, that's a corpus. And I looked at this corpus. I had a corpus for Spanish, a corpus for Portuguese, and a corpus for German. And I ran all of my long and short word forms choices through this corpus. And I used Shannon's mathematical formulas to calculate surprisal and entropy, basically to calculate the information content of those words, considering their context. And what the hypothesis said would be that the words that have a very like supportive context, that have a lot of information around that one word that I'm looking at, those should be shorter words, because if you have a lot of context, you don't need to convey as much new information in that last word, so it's shorter. And it said that if you have a very sparse neutral context where you don't really know what's coming, if you look at the words around the specific word of origin, that's more likely to be the longer word because it's a big informational punch. So that was the theory. I did the behavioral study in Spanish, and then I did the corpus analysis in all three languages. And what I found is that doesn't really happen. It's not really holding up in my results, which is an interesting result in and of itself. So there are a few reasons why that could be. We are getting to the end of my time, so I won't go into great detail, but I will say that one thing that I sort of included in my thesis is the concept of Zipf's law. Sorry to throw another term at you, but that's sort of this interesting mathematical distribution that, applied to linguistics at least, essentially says that the most common words in any language are like so much more common than any of the other words. And so it's like not even close. So if you imagine like a normal bell curve, like that sort of distribution, that's not even close. Like you have function words like and, but, I, like articles and prepositions and stuff like that. Those are so much more common than even the most common of nouns. So one reason why I'm finding that a lot of, there's very little difference in the information content of the words that I looked at, regardless of the context, which does not support the hypothesis. One potential reason for that is because they're all way less common than words like and or I or so. So that is sort of in a nutshell what I looked at, and it was interesting to try to look at it in other languages, and I'm looking forward to talking more at the question period.
Yay. Thank you, Jonathan. Next up is Olivia Henderson with her presenting her thesis, Like a Dull Actor, I Forgot My Part, Coriolanus, and Shakespearean Autism.
Hi, everyone. So I wrote my thesis about William Shakespeare's Coriolanus, which is one of his Roman tragedies. I don't know if a lot of people have heard of that one. I think Mary Tyler was telling me that her mom had no idea what that play was the other day. But anyway, it's based on a story in Plutarch's Lives, which is about a Roman general, Coriolanus, who's really known for his skill in battle, and then he tries to transition into being a politician, and it doesn't go very well for him. He dies at the end, spoiler alert, I'm sorry. So yeah, and it's interesting in that sense because when you think of some of the famous Shakespearean tragedies like Hamlet, everyone dies at the end, but in Coriolanus, it's just Coriolanus, like he's the only character who died. So it's a really intriguing aspect of the play. But anyway, when Coriolanus tries to become a politician, he consistently refuses to do certain social gestures. For example, there's this one scene where he's supposed to ask the plebeians, like, for their permission to run for office, essentially. That's kind of how I would summarize it. And he refuses to do it. He hates doing that. He like throws a fit, and it's just a really interesting scene. And scholars haven't really known what to make of it. Some view it as a byproduct of his dependence on his mother, and his mother's always like telling him all these weird things. So getting very like Freudian psychoanalyst, which is interesting. Others take a more Marxist approach, talking about how he doesn't care for the common people, and that's sort of where he's going wrong. But in my thesis, I argue that his behavior is more consistent with autism spectrum disorder. So kind of trying to get a new approach on to explain some phenomena in the play. Although this is an anachronistic term, scholars have used terms like the male gaze to describe older phenomena in texts. So I think in that sense, we can apply it to an older text. Furthermore, since autism is used to describe people whose behavior deviates from a particular set of social norms, I think we can kind of take that standard-based definition and apply it to older periods, which is something that's interesting to do. So it becomes a critical sense in that term. So because Coriolanus' society demands flexibility and they want him to perform these certain social rituals, but he doesn't really want to do them. In the first section of my thesis, I argue that Coriolanus' rigid adherence to his own behavior makes him seem more autistic. Still, it is important to account for the privilege and biases present even within the category of autism. Several scholars have pointed out that autistic characters in popular culture are often high-functioning white male savants, like Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory. That's a common interpretation of autism in our culture. And I argue that that stereotype fits Coriolanus pretty well. He's a member of the ruling class of Rome. He's a skilled warrior, like that's his savantness. He's so great at battle, he's amazing, etc. Whose social miscommunications are often viewed as harsh or rude, sort of like the stereotype I'm trying to get at. So in the second section of my thesis, I show how this stereotype of the autistic savant can describe Coriolanus, exploring what this means for his character and contemporary portrayals of autism. In the third and final section of my thesis, I argue that Judith Butler's concept of gender performance clarifies expectations of behavior in Shakespeare's Rome. Under this theory, gender is created through the repetition of social norms pertaining to an individual's gender identity. We all essentially perform a certain gender and try to meet the daily expectations of our gender through this performance. So I kind of adapt that to fit in more with autism. And disability studies normally allies itself with gender and sexuality studies. So it's a common sort of connection, and Robert McCreary does a similar thing in one of his books. But anyway, Coriolanus completely ignores the expectations of performance in his society. He refuses to perform daily social rituals and completely ignores important political ones. This angers his fellow politicians and eventually leads to his exile and death. I end my thesis by discussing the theatrical impact of portraying Coriolanus as autistic. Because autistic children are encouraged to take theater courses to adapt neurotypical social skills. I conclude that performing Coriolanus as autistic could provide a sense of social freedom to autistic children. So that's basically my thesis in a nutshell.
Excellent. Thank you, Olivia. Last but not least, Mary Tyler Storms will talk to us about her honors thesis, The Wise and Witty Women of Shakespeare's and Austen's Comedies. Take it away.
Thank you. Okay, so the genesis of this project was when I was studying Much Ado About Nothing and Pride and Prejudice in 2 different classes at the same time. And one day I was sitting in class and this little light bulb appeared over my head, and I thought, these are the same, because they are in a lot of ways. And I thought this could be a thesis. So I dug into that in the introduction of my thesis, which is about how these 2 works fulfill a lot of patterns that are foundational to the genre of romantic comedy. And I narrow in that introduction into a specific archetypal figure, the witty woman, who appears in both of those works and in many other romantic comedies through the centuries. There's a lot of different things that you see in the witty woman over and over again in different ways. She's usually subordinate in some way to another female figure, which is called the heiress. She's usually an outsider in some way. And that brings me to my first chapter, which is a study of Beatrice from Shakespeare's comedy, Much Ado About Nothing, which that character in that play are very foundational to the genre and to the other things that will come later in my thesis. I make the case that Beatrice is witty as well as wise. And together, those qualities become a kind of metaphor for what comedy can do. In comedy, you have a problem, and then Shakespeare says, okay, let's manipulate these characters, these situations, these events to produce a desired outcome. So, running with that idea, my second and third chapters are about how Austen plays with that idea of Shakespeare's. And my second chapter is about Sense and Sensibility. In that chapter, I basically ask the question, what happens when a woman in a comedy is wise, or at least rational, but not witty, through the character Eleanor Dashwood. And what I found was that actually that's kind of a problem, because for 2 reasons. First, without wit, she doesn't have that ability to manipulate her situation. And things do work out for Eleanor. It is a comedy, but only because outside forces intervene. She really can't do anything on her The second part of that is that she is rational, but she's not really wise until she eventually learns that rational truth also goes along with emotional truth. And that's a quality embodied in her sister Marianne. And they, through both those sisters, I also make a case for a political allegory there. The third chapter is the inverse question. What happens when you have a heroine in a comedy who is witty but not wise? And in that, I talk about Emma Woodhouse from Emma and Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. And what I found was that in both cases, even though the witty woman is very entertaining in both of those, she's kind of a disaster. She fails socially and morally, and Austen makes those works into comedies, but she does so by dealing with those characters in light of her own religious beliefs and specifically the Christian notion of grace. So that's basically my thesis. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. That was great. All four of you have done so much work and are so specialized. It's really kind of fascinating. I think although we have pretty diverse sets of fields and even approaches, even within like the two English papers, they're approaching things in such a different way. But I think there's some interesting connections across. We can, of course, you guys can jump in with any questions you want, but it's hard to come up with a question that shoots across all four, but 3 out of 4, maybe 4 if you can think of it. I'm wondering, a bunch of the papers deal with some sort of ritual in a way. So like Coriolanus, you've got resistance to ritual. In comedies, you have something aiming at marriage typically, and that's a kind of ritual or ceremony. And then Christmas songs, of course, ritualize our year and so forth. And I wonder if you guys can speak to and chime in, any of you who wants to. I'm not sure ritual with user information, I forget what it's called now, but the linguistic one. But maybe there's something in there as well, in the predictability issue with the theory. But what do you guys think about the role of ritual in your work, or how would you address somebody who wants to know more about ritual and its role with community or something like that in your work?
Well, yeah, Mary Tyler, you want to go?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so going along with what Professor Oldenburg just said, so in comedy, typically the ritual of marriage is the concluding, traditionally at least, is the big concluding event. And that comes up a lot in my research, because in order to understand these comedies, I almost always have to devote a passage or a footnote or something in every chapter to what marriage means to these characters in this specific situation. For example, in Much Ado About Nothing, the wedding at the end is kind of controversial. People go, what's going on here? Because this guy, the groom is acting a little bit like a jerk. Everyone thought the bride was dead. Sorry, spoiler alert. Everyone thought the bride, she's dead, and now she's back. She faked her death. Everyone's confused. But it doesn't match our idea of what a marriage looks like. But if you think about what their idea of marriage is, and what that ritual represents, basically a contractual alliance between people, essentially, then in that sense, then that scene actually is the happiest ending that could be imagined for these people. So yeah, that does play a role in my thinking. Off to Derby.
Yeah, very much so. In the analysis of Christmas music, every single song had to speak with the vocabulary of the Christmas thematic. And I talk about this in the first chapter of my thesis of the history of Christmas. For anyone who doesn't know, super brief history, Christmas is an amalgamation of so many different traditions between Saturnalia, Festival of the Children, Yuletide festivals, and it was just kind of thrown together by the Catholic Church as a way to provide the date of December 25th with something, because they didn't want Christian practitioners to practice what the pagans were practicing. And the pagans' Saturnalia was right on December 25th. So they tried to bring it all together. And they also wanted the pagans to be included in this Christmas celebration. So they included Saturnalia traditions. So we get this vocabulary from hundreds of years ago of what Christmas is supposed to be. And every single Christmas song has to play to these signifiers and these symbols that align with everything from Christmas trees to the sound of jingle bells to perfect cadential motion through the song. So yes, definitely ritual plays a huge part in the Christmas genre.
All right, I guess it's my turn now. While in my thesis, ritual obviously is very important, I discovered that there's a lot of rituals in Shakespeare's realm. I think I talked about that a bit during my 5-minute presentation. And by not performing these rituals, Coriolanus is really at odds with his social environment. And that was partially what I argued made him seem autistic. One of the things that was really interesting that I came across that I didn't really get into in my presentation was the idea of passing in the disability studies world, which it borrows the idea of racial passing, where a person of one race can pass for another. And kind of takes it into a disability studies context where a disabled person could pass as an able-bodied person. And I argued that there was this expectation in Rome that, and really in our society, that some autistic people try to pass as neurotypical. They try to adapt certain social gestures and do certain social rituals to seem more neurotypical. And so ritual plays an important part of that because they have to adapt all of these sorts of things. And I argue that Coriolanus did not do a great job at that, which is why he's not doing a great job of passing, and so he can't succeed in the political realm of Rome.
I could talk about ritual. So I actually have been thinking about it, and I really think that there is something, sort of a connection to make, because ritual is all about tradition and sort of repeated practices that become ingrained into a culture or into a set of into practice, essentially. So in many ways, language is all about ritual because you have a sort of coded system that you're using time and time again to convey a certain set of concepts. And information theory is all about sort of latching onto the repeatedness of this ritual if you look at language as a ritual. So one example that I didn't have time to share, and I'll do an English one because we all speak that. So there's a really cool information theoretic example. If I say the sentence, the children went outside to blank, and you all just thought of something in your minds. And then if I say the children came inside to blank, you also maybe thought of something. Now, that example has been tested multiple times, and in the one where it's when they went outside, almost everyone intuitively says play. It's like everyone says it. Whereas inside, people have much more diverse reactions. So some people say rest, some people say nap, some people say play. And so that's a really cool way of sort of exhibiting the phenomenon that's in my thesis, because if you look, let's just say that play was the correct answer in both sentences. You might think, oh, well, it's the same word, it has the same information, but it doesn't because information is so context dependent. In that first example where the kids went outside to play, basically you knew what was coming. And so when I actually say the word play, it adds a little bit because it confirms your suspicions, but it's not a lot of new information. Whereas in the other one, when I say the children came inside to play, when I say play, you get a lot more information from that. And I think the reason for that is because you have these sort of rituals or archetypes, things that you continue to say. And so we have this ritual that oh, you're going outside and you're a kid, you must be playing. Whereas that's not really a ritual that we have as much for going inside. So that's my attempt to connect that.
That's interesting. Everybody was able to bring something into it. I'm curious, Jonathan, about, and maybe others can jump in on this too, but I wanted to start with you. That sense of predictability, it's sort of, as the theory presents it, provides a kind of consistent level of information or something. But there's also like pleasure and inconsistency in a certain way, right? Like I gotta, there's with poetry or something like that, you're not wanting the word that you already know, maybe not. I mean, rhyme maybe allows you to be primed to expect certain words, but I mean, I know that you're not specializing in linguistic aesthetics or something, but that sense of unpredictability in language seems significant to me. And I wonder if you can address it, and maybe that works in with Christmas songs as well. Like the same song is not going to be so, why wouldn't I just keep listening to Jingle Bells or something? Or with Shakespeare or Austen, the unpredictability of things. And so I wonder if starting with Jonathan, we can talk about linguistic pleasure and your theory.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree that there is a sort of special notion or a special, almost an emotional feeling that unpredictability provides. And that sort of highlights what, in my opinion, might be a flaw of information theory, or specifically this hypothesis that says we're always want to communicate efficiently. Basically, when it comes down to it, what I'm writing about is about lexical choice. Why do we choose the words that we choose? And these two sort of theories would have you believe that, well, we choose it because we want to communicate efficiently. And often, I would venture to say, largely the majority of the time, we really do want to be efficient in our communication, but not always. And like poetry is not about efficiency. Poetry is not mathematical. It's about using language in a sort of craftful, artistic way. And I think that you have a lot of stuff like you have redundancy and you have repeated lines and you have specific words that are chosen not just because you're trying to be efficient, but because you're trying to be beautiful or you're trying to echo certain emotions. So I think it would be a really interesting future avenue to pursue as like, yes, we as humans have efficiency as really a hallmark or a cornerstone of how we communicate, but it's not the only thing playing a role. So what happens when these sort of factors clash?
Or jokes. I mean, I was thinking also demand a sort of unpredictable thing or a thing that stretches your attention in a certain way.
Right. Well, and jokes are also so context based, which is, this whole thing is all about context. So if I say, a man walked into a barn, like that's not what you were expecting. You're thinking bar. And so already the joke starts to get funny because he's walking into a barn and, oh, that's not what I was expecting. And so there's so much with whether you can predict what's happening that determines whether it's funny, that determines whether you understand it. Oftentimes that determines how much time you have to spend in the conversation, because if you hear something you weren't expecting, you have to go back and ask, like, wait, is that what you meant to say? That sort of thing. So there's a lot to examine there.
Others? Predictability, Derby, maybe?
Yeah, Christmas music, kind of speaking to what my assumption was at the beginning, for a song to be newly canonized, it can't be based on the commonalities of the canon. It has to have something different, something that's unpredictable. And this is musically and textually. I mean, when you think about I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, the Catholic and Protestant churches actually had a revolt against this song, and then it landed in the canon. And musically, I suggest if you ever want to listen to like the musical brilliance of the Christmas canon, This Christmas by Donny Hathaway has this weird moment, and he ends every phrase with it. It's a little brass, da da da, but it ends on the lowered fifth of, okay, I'm talking in music terms for a second, but it ends on the lowered fifth of this key signature, which is a very weird place to end. And it's in the low brass, it's loud, you hear it every single time, but that is the blues note in jazz theory. And so he's like presenting something that you wouldn't hear in the rest of the canon, and it's kind of addictive. It's such a cool sonic moment. So yeah, unpredictability, I think, is what each song has to have a little bit of it in order to allow for canonization.
Literary folks?
Yeah, I was thinking that what Jonathan said about jokes being funny because something unexpected happens, that goes along quite well with my work, because I mean, basically I have kind of the same theory, except not as a narrative, not as a joke, because the thing is that comedy consistently, in every work I studied that was a comedy, there's this idea that, you know, we have a problem, and then in order for it to be solved, something unexpected has to happen. Something like someone has to fake her death and then come back and get married. Somebody has to go off and ditch their fiance and marry the younger brother, who also happens to be the new heir to the. It's always these very. There's always some kind of mechanism that isn't linguistic, that's narrative, but it's all about making something happen that wasn't supposed to happen. That if things had been going the way they were going, it would not, that you are not led to believe that that will be the case, that a positive outcome will be the case.
Right. You can't have an Avengers movie without some sort of problem. They can't just have coffee and pastries every day, right? Good, good. Olivia, anything to add there? Or?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, with the form of tragedy, there's always this expectation that somebody is going to die at the end. Like, you can't get through a tragedy without somebody dying. So there's this predictability in that sense that, like, someone has to die, there's this problem, and it can only resolve by people dying. And normally I think, or at least I think I would argue it happens in Coriolanus, is it resolves through like getting rid of the unpredictable. Like, Coriolanus is an unpredictable element in his own society. We don't know how he's going to behave, and that makes the people around him really nervous, and they don't like that. So it's almost like his society, to like return to the predictable, because he's doing all these unpredictable things socially, gets rid of him predictably, I guess, if that makes any sense. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's scapegoated. So it's sort of like scapegoating the disability in a way. It's interesting. I can ask other questions, but I want you guys to have an opportunity to interrogate one another. Let's open it up to questions from the panelists to one another.
I have one for Mary Tyler.
You're fine.
Mary Tyler, I really liked hearing you sort of sum up your thesis. I think that really interesting looking at, you know, wit to manipulate one situation. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think is maybe the most successful example of someone using wit to manipulate her situation that you've seen as you've examined all these works for your thesis?
Ooh, interesting. I think the best example of that is probably, almost definitely, I think, in Sense and Sensibility. There is a character named Lucy Steele, who, again, spoiler alert, skip over this part if you've never seen or read Sense and Sensibility. There's a character named Lucy Steele who is very witty, but also very selfish. And she, at first, is Eleanor, the heroine who I study. She is Eleanor's big adversary because she is secretly engaged to the guy that Eleanor's in love with. And this is a big reveal, and it's a whole thing. And she, at first, uses wit to kind of put Eleanor in her place, kind of mark her territory and saying, he's the heir to the fortune, I'm going to marry him, back off. And then later on, there's this big twist. Again, spoiler alert, there's a big twist where it turns out that the secret engagement was found out. The older brother was disinherited. But Lucy says, I'm still going to get that fortune. And she gets the younger brother, newly inherited, to marry her. And thus, oddly, because it is a selfish act, but in a way, she is kind of the hero of the story because her selfishness allows everyone else, including the old fiance and Eleanor, to get what they want. So I would say that that is the best example. And I feel like that is a very telling example about what Austen thought about wit, that it's not necessarily a virtue. It doesn't mean you're a good character or a bad character, but it does mean you can do things that are useful.
That's great. Thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question for Olivia. Olivia, did you by any chance find that I wonder how much scholarship there was on this issue already, and I wonder if there would be more if there wasn't a lot, if the field already had less of an ableist lens, because I think literary analysis in general comes from the interpretation of, since we are capable of reading this literature, the characters themselves are capable of reading their context within the literature. So I wonder kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that people are starting to get better at realizing that. A lot of the stuff that's been done in disability studies and literature has been on more like obvious like physical disabilities, like something that you could like look at and be like, oh, like in our society that person is disabled. So in the field, I don't think there has been a lot of like more of a mental approach, like you were saying, like what is like their frame of reference? How is that different based on their point of view and whatnot? So that's been interesting to explore. There was another article that was written about Shakespeare and autism, and they took a different approach to exploring Coriolanus as an autistic society. They argued that he saw it as more of like an economic point of view, like, oh, in exchange for doing this social gesture, then I get this in return. And so that was a really interesting approach, and that's something that was important that was done, and I kind of didn't entirely agree with their methodology, so I like reframed it a little bit and tried a few other things. But it seems like people are really starting to think about it more from that point of view, which has been cool to see.
I have a question for Derby. And that's the question you alluded to earlier. I'm really curious about this. So one of my favorite Christmas songs is All I Want for Christmas Is You. And the reason is that scene in Love Actually. Ever since I saw Love Actually, that's been one of my favorite Christmas songs because of that point in that movie. And that's not the only one. That's my go-to example. But another example I thought of since I wrote that question actually is an old cartoon called A Year Without a Santa Claus. Are you familiar at all with that?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. And so you know the rendition of Blue Christmas?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, yeah. I'm super curious about what you think about that because I have a special nostalgia for the Elvis version and for that other version, which is they're so completely different in the way they've done that. And that song is totally transformed for the purposes of A Year Without a Santa Claus.
Right.
So I was just wondering how that fits into your thinking.
Yeah, so in two ways. First of all, a piece's inclusion in a film score normally leads to its canonization, but beyond that, the singer who performs the piece in the film score is normally the preference on the canon. So, for example, Jimmy Durant is preferred 9 times over 10 on the canon because of his voicing in all of the stop motion films. We adore him because we grew up as kids with him as a voice, even though his performance is fascinating to analyze because he makes the song very singable in that his voice cracks. It's out of his register sometimes. It's kind of a clumsy rendition, but we're okay with it because he was the guy who's narrating us through the scene. So yeah, and the A Year Without a Santa Claus is also interesting because the production and distribution of that film altered the chart. And you can see when the generation that grew up with that movie kind of gets more control over the canon, and it's normally when we grow up and have kids, which we're not at yet, but other previous generations are, the canon starts to shift again. So we don't prefer the Elvis version often, and so we'll find that the film's cover rises in the charts, and that kind of happens with every single iteration of a film. And we see this with so many different songs, including and especially the Vince Guaraldi trio in the Peanuts movie. There are 3 songs by Vince Guaraldi on the canon, and they're really the only instrumental pieces. And it's because we grew up watching the Peanuts walk onto the little snow bank to Vince Guaraldi playing the piano. So yes, that played a huge role. And it's funny to see how our preferences and what we grew up with builds our nostalgia, which then solidifies a certain voice in the charts.
I can ask Jonathan a question. So I think you mentioned that you did a corpus analysis on Portuguese, German, and Spanish, correct? So I was wondering like how those languages varied and like was one more predictable than the other or the other
It's a great question, because that was something I was really interested in as I started this project. And this project consisted of several surprises. The first surprise was that no, the languages, in terms of the information content of the like individual words, whether they be the long forms or the short forms, they were remarkably consistent across languages. And that's strange because when we analyze different languages from, well, even from like a descriptive point of view, but especially from a mathematical point of view, it's rare to have things lining up so much. And what was also interesting was that we found that there are actually, they all fall within a very small range, and it doesn't matter whether they're short or long. I won't go into all of the math, but as arbitrarily, I will say that they all fall in like the 13 to 14 bit range, which I know doesn't necessarily mean anything, but that was weird. And we're like, why are all of these languages so similar? So that was interesting, and that's sort of evidence against the hypothesis. And I'm reluctant to criticize the hypothesis too much because the people that came out with it are much more qualified than I, but it was an interesting result. And I'll finally say one difference that was interesting across the languages. Just when I was coming up with what words to look at in German, Spanish, and Portuguese, I was looking for words that were semantically identical, so they mean the same thing, and they had to be like morphologically related. So like I wasn't going to use small and tiny because those like come from different roots. They're different like words. I wanted them to be sort of like truncated forms or abbreviations, but mean the same thing. And so you'd think like most languages have these sorts of abbreviations or shortened forms, but they're way more common in some languages. So Spanish, I started with Spanish, and Spanish, I had moderate success. There are like, not a ton, but there are a good number. Portuguese, it was really hard for some reason, and I can't tell you exactly why. There are very few of these, especially compared to Spanish. And then in German, there were a ton. And my only theory for that is why there are so many in German is because German is like sort of an agglutinating language that makes a ton of like really long words because you can just keep shoving like parts of words onto each other. And so it makes sense to have abbreviations. But I have no idea because Spanish and Portuguese are so related. They're very similar. It's weird that Spanish has a significant number of these and Portuguese has so few. So those were the differences I found.
Just a follow-up, Jonathan. You talked about your corpus analysis. Does the hypothesis play out better in spoken language?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're absolutely correct that like you have to approach the media differently because like spoken language is very different from written language. Initially, I was sort of, based on the results that I was getting initially, I was sort of thinking, okay, it looks like it's playing out better in spoken language. I had slightly better. My results, according to the Spanish experimental behavioral test that I did with native speakers, are a little bit more aligned with the hypothesis than the corpus results. The corpus results really say like, no, there's no correlation here. The experimental ones show like a little bit, but it's not really statistically significant. And so I personally, if I had to choose, do think that there's more to this theory if it's spoken language than written. The written language in many ways is a lot more diverse. Like it has a lot of different goals, whereas spoken language has many goals, of course, but it's a little bit more similar if you look from conversation to conversation. So I think that there are differences. Whether I can say definitively what those are is another story, but based on everything that I've done for this project, my gut is that it's more likely to work in spoken language.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I lived in Central America for a while and I spoke Spanish really well. And then I tried to read Cien Años de Soledad. I was like, there's just too many synonyms. Like every time I came across the word pebble, it was a different word for
Yes.
pebble. It's like, oh, small rock, slightly rounder rock. I mean, but so I think there's prose style maybe in there, maybe complicates some of the predictability of the hypothesis.
Yeah, no, I totally, and I think that especially like nowadays, a lot, especially in English, German is interesting. German has a very different like spoken register versus what's written. The writing is still a lot more formal, and that includes like the tenses that they use, which is not really how we do it as much in English. In English, there is a difference in what we speak and what we write. Writing still tends to be more formal, but it's not as pronounced. But yeah, I think there's definitely a difference there, and especially nowadays as we're starting to, in many languages, formality is on the decline, just as a sweeping generalization. So I think that spoken language, you can see it a lot more directly than like sort of more flowery literary language.
Interesting. Thank you. Derby, you talked about the American canon, but you started with an article or a book or a study based out of the UK. And I know for many decades in like November in the UK, there's a rush of bands trying to get a new Christmas hit. And so I wonder if you've looked at the differences from country to country. It's different from the United States. There's so many bands try to get their Christmas hit on the UK charts. Maybe because it's a smaller country, so you can get traction more quickly. But and then I know that there are English Christmas songs that we just don't identify with in the United States, like Slade's "Merry Christmas, Everyone" is a popular rock song. Unless you watch BBC TV, you don't hear it ever in the United States. So I'm curious about different cultures in there. I don't know if you're equipped to talk about it, but different cultures in their Christmas canon.
Sure. So actually, my decision to stay within the United States was very deliberate because there's a song on the UK's charts that I do not understand and don't understand why I don't understand its place on the canon. It's I'm forgetting the full name of it now, but it's something Christmas time in New York or New York Christmas or something like that.
Is it the Pogues?
Sorry?
Is it the Pogues song "Fairy Tale in New York"?
Yes, that's it. That's it. Yes, and the word, have the rest of you heard it by any chance? Okay, so if you go just look up the lyrics, they're very odd. It's not it would not be okay, let me say this. If the Protestant and Catholic churches revolted against "I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus," they would have a fit with this song. And so it doesn't make sense to me. Like there's so many cultural nuances and intricacies that would allow for that song to top chart every single year, that I just didn't want to get into because it's so different from the United States. So I was very deliberate in just saying in the United States. But it's actually interesting that you asked that because I'm going to study popular music in crisis in England for my master's degree, and I kind of want to do a comparative Christmas study. I haven't decide if I'm going to do Christmas music there, but that's kind of what inspired me to study that for my master's, because there are very big differences that I wasn't ready to get into yet.
Yeah, I was thinking of that song. For those of you who don't know the song, the first lyrics are, "It was Christmas Eve, babe, in the drunk tank," and it goes from there. It's a good song, but it's not as popular in the United States as it is in the UK. Interesting. Other questions you guys might have for one another?
Oh, Mary Tyler, I have a question for you. So we took the Jane Austen class together, and I was thinking about this through your thesis. I remember Dr. Rothenberg talked briefly about Jane Austen kind of using her literature as her voice sometimes, of just kind of expressing her opinions here and there. Did you find any of that of like any of, beyond obviously Jane Austen as the author, but Jane Austen, her narration as authorship sometimes of like her own opinions in this? Did you get into that at all?
Yeah, I did. Okay. So there were, that was kind of actually what most surprised me as I was doing my research, is that studying for both of those chapters on Austen, I stumbled upon something that had to do with her historical moment, something that came up in the letters, something that came up, and that actually was probably the most interesting part of this whole thing, was that people don't usually think of Jane Austen as you know, we talked about this, people tend to not think about Jane Austen that way because of her choices about narrative and the genre she was working with, but it's definitely there. She does have, for instance, working on the second chapter, as I mentioned in my summary, that eventually that study of Eleanor led me to discover that there's kind of a political allegory going on with Eleanor and Marianne. Marianne actually was the name for the French revolutionaries' replacement of the Virgin Mary, with this goddess of liberty. That's what they called her, Marianne. And Jane Austen would have known that because she had the coolest family, y'all. Like, why isn't there a miniseries? I don't know. But like, I would get so distracted just looking into the lives of all the different people she was connected to. She had a cousin who was the widow of a Frenchman who was guillotined in the Revolution. The cousin comes back, hangs out with the Austens, flirts with two of the Austen brothers at once, convinces one to marry her. I mean, it's this whole thing. And then two of the brothers, I think a different set of brothers, became admirals in the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, it's just on and on. So she was very intimately aware of the history of her time. It directly impacted her family life. And she, so I kind of make a case that Eleanor, her way of thinking has a lot to do with old ideas about society that are still prevalent, primogeniture and monarchy. And then Marianne is sort of about individualism and revolution and all of that, those kinds of things. And it's very telling then that the solution is that these sisters have to learn to sort of switch places and share experiences and learn from each other. So I feel like there is some kind of sneaky opinion going on there. And also her, the third chapter, the big surprise there was that I realized that her treatment of those characters, I think, must have had to do with some of her religious opinions and different changes that were going on in the church at that time. And, you know, there was a movement right at her time because within the Anglican Church, because up until that time, the church's emphasis had been more about obligation and like what you owe the church. And then an evangelical movement started that said, this is not what is actually true as far as Christianity goes. We need to be the emphasis should be the grace of God. And we see her in her letters shifting as well with that movement. We also, there are these published prayers that she has, which no one talks about. And I actually found that, and I was like, why are there not big articles about this? There's a wealth of information here about Jane Austen. So yeah, I do think all that to say, yes, I agree with you. And I agree with what Professor Rothenberg said about how she's, you know, Jane Austen is sort of sneaking some opinions in there for sure. That ended up being a big part of my work.
Good. So you're gonna spend the summer writing the pilot for this television show?
I mean, honestly, I would, you know, I found a website, again, while I was down one of these rabbit holes, you know, how it goes sometimes in research, you just find a thing, you're like, where does that lead? And I found myself on this rinky-dinky little genealogy site, just like looking at all the different relatives and how they're related. And because that is a big deal in Austen research, because a lot of what we know about her is from letters to her nieces. And so the nieces, you know, then you find out, well, then you want to know, who did the nieces marry? What happened with this? You know, she would give them advice about, you know, suitors and things like this. And then you would find out that one of them married a famous politician and one of them, you know, yada, yada, all these different things. And then I looked at the bottom of this website and I realized that it had been made by Steve Austen, spelled like Jane Austen. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is one of the nephews, Steve, it's time for the mini-series. Come on. Where is it?
Other questions you guys have? I have one more for Olivia. It just occurred to me, you know, Coriolanus is kind of one of the minor tragedies in lots of ways, because, and the thing that people often talk about with Hamlet are all the soliloquies, and with Macbeth, all of his soliloquies. And I wonder, Coriolanus, I don't remember, I should know off the top of my head, but does he have soliloquies? And what, if he doesn't, what does that mean for the sort of neurotypical, neuroatypical reading of the play?
I can't think of any soliloquies off the top of my head. I think throughout the play, I guess, yeah, well, that's not a soliloquy. Like, he kind of speaks to Ophidius longer for a bit, but I don't think that's a soliloquy. But anyway, kind of aside. He's more of a man of action than a man of words. He doesn't really like sitting around and speaking. I get the sense he doesn't like debating things with people. He's just kind of like, oh, put a sword in my hand and I'll go kill some people for you. Too much chatter. Let's do some stuff. And that, in a way, makes things more difficult for him because he doesn't understand that he needs to talk to people and he needs to like express his thoughts and be eloquent to move through the social world of Rome. So yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it in that way.
Yeah, you don't really get his interiority, and maybe the military is his way of avoiding all the different discomforts that he has and trying to perform sort of neurotypical behaviors or something.
Yeah, and he doesn't like to be emotional, really. Yeah, he's always like angry, or maybe he's just chilling out, but that's it. He doesn't like to show sadness. That makes him very uncomfortable, or any other emotions that could really destroy this image of like, I am the perfect warrior. And so I don't think he would like just like speaking like, oh, here's everything that's going on in my head right now. I'm upset about this, because he's a soldier and that's how he sees himself.
Yeah, no intimate conversations with his spouse in the play. Interesting. Other questions you guys might have? Well, that was a really, really interesting and exciting conversation, and thank you so much. Each project sounds so interesting, and one can tell that you guys have developed and have so much more to say, and are able to spin what you know out into different directions. It's a real accomplishment. You guys should be really proud of yourselves. And we couldn't come together in one room, but we're in one sort of chat room of sorts. And this video will be up and shared with many other people who will probably be inspired to write honors theses because of your excellent presentations. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for moderating for us.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
My pleasure. It's a great way to spend the afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
Right. Thank you.
I have
And best of luck.